Most people at Halberg International never really noticed the cleaning crew. It wasn't personal, just the usual rhythm of office life where those who push carts, change trash bags, and mop floors seemed to blend into the background. Denise Atwater was one of those people, quietly moving through the building's polished halls long after most employees had gone home. 13 years of this job had made her practically invisible, which in some ways she didn't mind. But that Monday morning changed. Everything in a way she never could have expected. The lobby was its usual blur of clacking heels, coffee cups, and half-finished conversations. Denise was mopping near the touchscreen directory when Jonathan Kellerman, the CEO, walked past on his way to the executive suite. He wasn't thinking about anything but the pile of vendor contracts waiting on his desk when something stopped him cold. Mandarin. Not just words, but fluent, natural Mandarin, spoken with the confidence of someone who'd lived in it, not just studied it. He paused, scanning the lobby, expecting maybe an international sales rep had arrived early. But then he saw her, Denise, standing there in her burgundy janitor uniform, her short twists pulled back neatly, calmly helping an older man in thick glasses find his way. She was pointing toward the elevators, her voice warm and clear, switching effortlessly between giving directions and soothing his confusion. Kellerman took a step closer, intrigued not just by the sound of Mandarin, but by the fact that it was coming from someone he'd walked past 100 times without ever stopping to notice. Just as the older man thanked her and walked off, Denise turned to another person, a delivery driver holding a clipboard, and fluidly shifted into Spanish, helping him navigate the maze of office suites. Before Kellerman could fully process what he was witnessing, she turned again, addressing a vendor in French, correcting the mislabeled boxes with ease and a faint smile. It was like watching someone flip light switches, language after language, smooth and unbothered. For a man who'd built his career expanding Halberg's global operations, hiring translators, and preaching about cross-cultural fluency, this moment hit hard. The most linguistically gifted person in his building had been scrubbing toilets just 2 floors below his office. A knot formed in his chest, something tighter than just surprise, maybe guilt or shame, or the realization that he'd overlooked someone remarkable right under his nose. He stepped forward, less as a CEO and more as a curious human being, and said quietly, "Excuse me?" She turned toward him, a little startled but completely composed, replying, "Yes, sir." And just like that, the day that would change both of their lives began. Kellerman stood there for a moment, still a bit stunned by how naturally she'd handled all those interactions. "That was Mandarin, right?" he asked, trying to sound casual but feeling anything but. Denise gave a small nod. "Yes, sir." "And Spanish? And French?" She nodded again, just as calmly, adding, "Also Portuguese, German, Arabic, Italian, Swahili, and I can read Latin, though I don't really count that." Her tone wasn't boastful, there was no hint of pride or arrogance, just a quiet delivery of facts, as if she were telling him her height or eye color. Kellerman blinked hard, trying to wrap his head around what she'd just said. 9 languages. 9. And here she was, in a janitor's uniform, invisible to nearly everyone who passed her by every single day. For a split second, he felt like the ground under him had shifted. He'd spent decades in global logistics, crafting initiatives around language diversity, hiring teams of professional interpreters, but never, not once, had he considered that someone on the overnight cleaning crew might have more linguistic skills than most of his executives. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice softer now. "Denise Atwater." There was a pause where neither of them quite knew what to say next. Then he found himself asking something he hadn't even planned. "Miss Atwater, are you free for a few minutes?" She looked at him with the kind of hesitation that comes from years of being ignored or underestimated. Not fear, just a quiet reflex. After a second, she nodded. "All right." And with that, Kellerman pressed the elevator button and held the door open for her. Inside the elevator, a heavy silence settled between them. But it wasn't uncomfortable. It was just full of things that neither of them quite knew how to say yet. About halfway up, Denise broke it, her voice even but carrying something unspoken underneath. "I've worked here for 13 years. Kellerman turned his head toward her, a bit surprised. "Never thought I'd be invited up," she added, almost like a confession. Not angry, just stating a fact. He gave a small, quiet smile. "You might be surprised how quickly things can change. But as those words left his mouth, he realized, even he had no idea just how much was about to shift, not just for her, but for him too. The elevator dinged, and the doors slid open onto the executive floor, where everything looked different. Sleek, expensive, quiet in a way that made you lower your voice without knowing why. Denise stepped out first, her shoes making almost no sound on the polished wood floors that smelled faintly of citrus and leather. Money, if you had to name it. Kellerman's assistant looked up from her desk, her eyes going wide at the sight of Denise beside him. He didn't explain, just nodded for her to let them through. Moments later, they were inside his office, surrounded by glass walls, a massive desk, and the kind of view that makes you forget what street you're on. He gestured for her to sit, and as she lowered herself into the chair, folding her hands neatly in her lap, he realized something else. She wasn't impressed by the space, just observant, taking it all in quietly, like someone who'd learned a long time ago not to expect anything from places like this. Kellerman sat across from her, leaning forward slightly, still trying to wrap his mind around what had just happened in the lobby. So, Denise, I'm going to be honest. I didn't expect to be having this conversation today. She gave a small nod, her posture straight, her face unreadable, not defensive, just practiced in the art of keeping emotions in check. But he pressed on, needing to understand. I just heard you switch between 3 languages like it was nothing, and I need to know, how does someone like you end up here, working, cleaning floors? For a second, Denise didn't answer. She glanced out the window, the city skyline sharp against the morning haze, then back at him. You got time for the truth? She asked, her voice steady, almost like she was offering him a way out. He didn't flinch. I wouldn't have asked otherwise. She exhaled slowly, rubbing her palms together like she was warming up for something she hadn't had to say in a long time. I was born in Toledo, Ohio, only child. My dad was a pipe fitter, my mom a nurse's aide. They didn't have much, but they worked hard, pushed education like it was religion. I got a full ride to Kent State, majored in linguistics. Was halfway through a master's when my mother got sick. She paused, her eyes drifting again as if she had to rewind the memory before she could say it out loud. I came home to take care of her. Then my dad passed. Stroke. 6 months later. Everything just fell apart after that. Kellerman didn't say anything. He knew this part. The part where life drops an unexpected weight on your shoulders and dares you to keep moving. Denise tilted her head slightly, her voice softer now but still controlled, like someone who'd had to tell this story before but never to someone like him. I had a baby, no money, no partner who stuck around, so I worked whatever I could find. Grocery stores, nursing homes, temp jobs. Eventually, a custodial supervisor here offered me night hours. It let me pick up my daughter from school, keep the lights on. That's how I got here. Kellerman listened, his hands folded loosely in front of him, not interrupting once. He wasn't sure what he'd expected, maybe some complicated backstory filled with twists. But the simplicity of her journey hit harder than he thought it would. And then she added, almost like an afterthought, but the languages, I didn't stop learning. Borrowed textbooks, listened to recordings, read newspapers in 5 different tongues just to stay sharp. It's what I do. It's the only thing I do that makes me feel like I still matter. There wasn't a tremor in her voice, no trace of self-pity or dramatics, just plain, clean truth. She shrugged lightly. Most people never ask, she added, looking down at her hands. They see the uniform and assume. That word sat there between them, heavier than it should have been. Kellerman leaned back in his chair, letting the full weight of her story settle into his chest. It wasn't just impressive, it was humbling. And for a man who prided himself on being able to spot talent, it was a gut punch to realize how easily he'd overlooked it. Denise cleared her throat then, as if to signal the end of her story, or maybe to keep herself from adding anything else that didn't need to be said. Look, Mr. Kellerman, I'm not saying this to make anyone feel bad. I'm not bitter. Life happened. I did what I had to do. I still do. But, you asked. That's the answer. She looked up at him, not challenging, just waiting. And he sat there, feeling like her words had landed somewhere deep, somewhere he hadn't expected. Denise Atwater wasn't asking for pity or even a promotion. She was just telling him the truth, clean and unadorned, the way people do when they're too tired or too honest to bother dressing it up. He let out a long breath, leaning back in his chair, staring at the map of the world pinned up behind his desk, a map he'd used for years to plot international expansions, build logistics routes, negotiate contracts in cities he barely had time to visit. And yet, here, in this building, in a janitor's uniform, sat someone more globally fluent than half his leadership team. "You ever think about doing anything else?" he asked, his voice quieter now, almost careful. Denise gave a small shrug. "Sometimes, but it's hard to dream when your rent's due." She didn't say it with anger or even resignation, just as a fact. A fact he knew too many people in this building, in this city, in this country, lived with every single day. The room fell quiet again, but it was a different kind of silence now, one thick with all the things neither of them had the words for. Kellerman reached for his notebook then, almost on instinct, flipping to a blank page and jotting something down. Denise tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing with quiet curiosity. "What are you writing?" she asked, her voice still, calm but with just the faintest edge of intrigue. He looked up at her, offering a small, knowing smile. Ideas. But the truth was, it wasn't just a list of random thoughts. One specific idea was already forming in his mind, something he hadn't expected when he left his house that morning. Something big. The conversation stayed with him all day, haunting him even as he sat through budget reviews and vendor calls. He couldn't stop thinking about it, about her, the way she'd listed 9 languages, like it was no big deal, like it was just a part of her, not some extraordinary accomplishment. That kind of fluency didn't just happen. It took years of practice, of discipline, of curiosity and heart. Around 3:45 p.m., after hours of trying to focus on spreadsheets and quarterly goals, he finally pushed back from his desk, grabbed his jacket, and rode the elevator down to the building's service level. He wasn't even sure why at first, just that he needed to see something for himself. Down. There, the air was warmer, heavier with the smell of cleaning supplies and old floor wax. The walls were a dull off-white, scuffed from years of carts and boots. He passed by maintenance crews, break rooms filled with tired employees eating their dinners out of plastic containers, stacks of bottled water, and then finally, the janitorial supply room. Through the open door, he spotted her, Denise, restocking microfiber cloths on a metal shelf, moving with the same quiet efficiency he'd seen that morning, like she belonged there but also didn't. He knocked lightly on the metal doorframe, not wanting to startle her, though she still turned a bit sharply, clearly surprised to see him there of all places. "You came down here?" she asked, wiping her hands on her shirt almost reflexively. He smiled, standing just inside the room now. Couldn't stop thinking about our talk. For a moment, they both stood there in the cramped space surrounded by brooms, buckets, and boxes of cleaning solution. The kind of place Kellerman had probably never set foot in before. Then he cleared his throat and said, "Listen, I have a favor to ask." Denise raised an eyebrow, cautious but not closed off. "What kind of favor?" He rubbed the back of his neck, suddenly feeling a little awkward asking someone for help in their own space. "There's a meeting upstairs. Group from the Sao Paulo office showed up early. Our translator canceled last minute. I know it's not your job, but can you help?" She hesitated, but only for a second, then gave a small nod. "Portuguese? Yeah, I can do that." Kellerman exhaled like he'd been holding his breath. Minutes later, they were walking side by side through the maze of hallways, up the elevator, and into conference room 4C. 4 Brazilian executives sat at the table, awkwardly checking their phones and flipping through papers, their frustration visible in every impatient glance. Denise stepped in quietly, nodded politely, and without missing a beat, began speaking, in smooth, confident Portuguese. Kellerman stood off to the side, watching as the entire atmosphere in the room shifted almost instantly. Shoulders relaxed, faces softened, and the tension that had been building from the language barrier just dissolved. Denise wasn't just translating words. She was connecting people, making them feel seen and understood in a way that went far beyond vocabulary. One of the Brazilian visitors cracked a joke in Portuguese, and Denise responded just as quickly with a return joke that made all of them laugh, including the stern-looking exec who hadn't smiled since they walked in. Kellerman didn't understand a word of what they were saying, but he didn't need to. He could see it, the human connection, the ease, the trust. After about 20 minutes, the meeting wrapped up smoothly, more productive than anyone had expected considering the rocky start. One of the Brazilian executives turned to Kellerman and, in crisp English, said, "She's better than anyone we've worked with this year. Where'd you find her?" Kellerman looked over at Denise, who was already gathering up the empty coffee cups and stacking them neatly on a tray, like it was just another part of her day. He smiled faintly and said, "Right here." As they stepped back into the hallway, Kellerman caught up to her and asked, "You ever do professional translation before?" Denise shook her head. "Not officially, just helped people out. Hospitals, government offices, stuff like that. No certificate, no time for school. My daughter needed me more." He nodded, processing it all, then asked quietly, "And where is she now?" Denise smiled for the first time that day. "She's 26, a nurse, in Tempe, paid for school herself, stubborn, like her mama." They both laughed, and for a second, it didn't feel like CEO and janitor anymore. Just two people talking about life. They made their way back down to the service level together, the place where Denise had spent more nights than she could count, where the floors were always a little damp, the air heavy with disinfectant, and the clock seemed to move just a bit slower than it did upstairs. Denise clocked back in quietly, like nothing out of the ordinary had just happened. But before she grabbed her cart to finish the 2 floors left on her shift, she turned to Kellerman and said something that stuck with him longer than any quarterly report ever could. "I didn't do anything special today." He looked at her, his eyebrows raised in genuine surprise. "That's not how it looked to me." She gave him a small, almost shy smile, then walked off down the hall, pushing her cart toward the elevator like it was just another Monday. But for Kellerman, it wasn't just another Monday. That night, he sat in his car in the parking garage long after most of the lights in the building had gone dark, thinking about everything. The pressure from investors, the endless meetings about diversity and innovation, the constant hunt for talent, and now this. A janitor, hidden in plain sight, who had just bridged cultural gaps with more grace and competence than some of his highest-paid consultants. All this time, they'd been looking outside the company, recruiting globally, hunting for new blood. But maybe sometimes the gold's already in your backyard. And once you realize that, he thought, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter, the real question becomes, what are you going to do about it? The answer didn't take long to come. The very next morning, Denise's badge beeped at a time it never usually did. Mid-morning, just after she'd finished wiping down the east lobby. Her supervisor, Ron, tapped her on the shoulder, his face carrying a look that wasn't quite annoyed, but definitely wasn't normal either. "Hey, Denise, Mr. Kellerman asked to see you again." She blinked, caught completely off guard. "Did I do something wrong?" Ron shook his head quickly. "No, he didn't say. Just told me to send you up." Denise cleaned, her hands on a towel, her mind already spinning as she followed the now familiar path she'd taken just the day before. The long walk past people who barely noticed her most days. But today, they were looking. People glanced up as she passed. A few whispered. One of the receptionists even gave her a polite smile, the kind that said, "We know something's up." Denise kept her head down, trying to stay grounded, but she could feel it. That shift, like the entire building had tilted slightly on its axis, and now everyone was watching. When she walked into the executive suite, Kellerman was standing near the window, sipping black coffee, staring out at the skyline as if he hadn't been waiting for her at all. "Come in," he said, not turning around yet. She stood quietly by the door until he finally faced her. "I've been thinking," he began, setting his mug on a coaster, "about talent, about waste. How many people never get a shot? Not because they're not good, but because nobody looks twice." Denise said nothing. She didn't trust easy praise. She'd seen too many people talk big and do little. So she just waited, arms loosely crossed, her face calm but cautious. Kellerman took a breath, then continued, his tone more deliberate now. "I want to create a new position, one that didn't exist before. Something this company badly needs, even if we didn't realize it until now." Denise furrowed her brow, unsure if she was hearing him right. "For what?" she asked, the question coming out sharper than she intended, more defense mechanism than curiosity. "Cultural liaison for international affairs," he replied without hesitation. "Someone who can speak the languages, read between the lines, handle visitors, vendors, documents, all the global touch points that we're constantly fumbling through." She opened her mouth, then closed it again, her brain trying to process not just the words, but the weight behind them. "You're qualified," Kellerman added quickly, seeing her hesitation. "Probably more than most of the people on our leadership team, honestly. And you've already proved you can handle it, with grace, patience, and brains." Denise stared at him, her eyes narrowing slightly as if to scan for any trace of a joke. But all she saw was sincerity, maybe even urgency. "This real?" she asked quietly, almost like she didn't want to say it too loud in case it shattered the moment. "As real as it gets," he replied. She shook her head slightly, disbelief and suspicion mingling in the tilt of her chin. "I don't have a college degree." Kellerman shrugged. "You have something better. Lived experience, commitment, fluency in 9 languages. You think I care about a piece of paper?" She shifted her weight, folding her arms tighter, still not fully buying it. "Why me?" she asked finally. And that was the question that had been sitting at the edge of her mind since the moment Ron tapped her shoulder. Kellerman didn't miss a beat. He looked her directly in the eye and said, "Because I watched you solve 3 problems in 3 different languages before 9 a.m. yesterday. And because I'm tired of walking past people like you, people doing twice the work for half the credit." Denise let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. The room felt warmer suddenly, more claustrophobic, like the walls of that glass office were pressing in. She crossed her arms again, tighter this time, and said, "You know what people are going to say." Kellerman nodded. "I don't care." She stared at him for a long moment, her mind spinning with all the ways this could go wrong, all the assumptions, all the whispered doubts she'd overheard for years working in this building. Finally, she let out a slow breath and said, "I've never had an office job, never had a title." He smiled, leaning back in his chair. "You'll learn fast." Denise gave a dry chuckle, more reflex than amusement. "I don't even have a wardrobe for this kind of thing." Kellerman grinned. "I'll have HR. Send a clothing stipend." She shook her head, this time actually laughing a little. "You thought of everything, huh?" "I'm trying," he said. The smile still there, but his tone softer now, like he understood that this was about more than just a job. It was about rewriting a story that had been in motion for over a decade. Then Denise asked, her voice quieter now, "What about my shift downstairs? Who replaces me?" Kellerman smiled faintly. "We'll find someone, but no one can replace you." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Denise looked down at her hands, then back at Kellerman, her eyes glistening but her face composed, not willing to give in to tears. "Not here, not now." "You sure this isn't some kind of favor?" she asked, her voice steady but edged with something vulnerable, something that had been shaped by years of people offering pity instead of opportunity. Kellerman shook his head, leaning forward again. "This is overdue recognition." Denise bit her lip, blinking quickly before anything could fall. Then, with a breath that felt heavier than the entire building, she nodded once and said, "All right then, let's see what I can do." He extended his hand across the desk and she took it, firm and confident. It wasn't just a handshake. It was the moment both of their stories changed for good. But neither of them could have predicted what would happen next, how this private decision would become public faster than either of them expected. By Wednesday, the news had traveled faster than the elevators. Denise Atwater, the janitor from the night shift, had been promoted to an executive-level position. Nobody knew the full story, just whispers that she spoke a bunch of languages, that the CEO himself had chosen her, that maybe she had some kind of secret background, maybe government work, maybe undercover. The gossip bounced from cubicle to conference room, from Slack messages to break room whispers. Some folks were genuinely curious, some smiled and said, "Good for her," but not everyone was clapping. In the staff lounge, 2 marketing assistants leaned close over their salads, their voices hushed but sharp. "I'm just saying," one whispered, stabbing a crouton with her fork. "I have a master's in international business and I've been waiting 2 years for a promotion." Her friend shrugged, offering a neutral, non-committal nod. "Maybe she knows something we don't." The first one scoffed. "Oh, please, it's Kellerman trying to look progressive." Check. A box. That same kind of energy, resentment mixed with confusion, trickled quietly into boardrooms and departmental meetings. People weren't used to upward moves coming from outside the usual ladder, from someone who hadn't been groomed through leadership seminars and quarterly performance reviews. Denise felt it the second she stepped into her new office on the 12th floor, a modest space with just a desk, a plant, and a computer she hadn't even touched yet. But to her, it felt like another planet. When HR finished onboarding her, she asked if she could keep the night uniform, not to wear, but to remind herself. She folded it neatly and placed it in her locker before walking upstairs, knowing that whatever this next chapter held, she wasn't about to forget where she'd come from. That afternoon, Denise had her first official meeting in her new role, sitting across from Victor, the head of international operations. He walked in with a clipboard and tight eyes, not offering a handshake, not even sitting down. "So, you're the new liaison," he said flatly, the words wrapped in a thin layer of politeness that couldn't quite hide the skepticism underneath. Denise looked up at him, keeping her face neutral. "That's what I'm told," she replied evenly. Victor raised an eyebrow, then glanced down at the folder in his hands. "You have experience in corporate environments?" Denise smiled faintly, not as a show of defiance, but because the question itself seemed almost absurd. "Only from the outside looking in." Victor didn't laugh, didn't even crack a smile. He simply dropped a thick folder on her desk with a dull thud. "I've got reports from Italy, contracts from our Dubai partners, and an entire vendor issue in Sao Paulo. Think you can manage that?" Denise didn't flinch. She stood up slowly, her fingers grazing the edges of the folder. "I'll need a few hours to review, but yes." Victor nodded curtly and walked out without another word, leaving Denise standing there, her hands on the folder, her mind already sifting through the pages before she even opened them. This wasn't just a test of her skills, it was a test of her right to be here at all. Later that night, as the office emptied out and the fluorescent lights dimmed one by one, Kellerman stopped by her office. He leaned casually against the doorframe, his tie loosened, his eyes carrying the same mix of curiosity and quiet admiration they had when he first heard her speaking Mandarin in the lobby. "How's day one?" he asked, his voice light but sincere. Denise exhaled deeply, leaning back in her chair, her eyes flicking briefly to the folder Victor had left behind. "I've had worse." Kellerman chuckled softly. "Victor give you a hard time?" She shrugged, then smiled faintly. "He doesn't scare me." Kellerman nodded, as if he already knew that. Then there was a pause, comfortable, reflective. Finally, Denise added, "But can I ask you something?" Kellerman straightened up a bit. "Anything." She looked at him, her expression serious but not confrontational. "Why now? Why me? You could have just given me a bonus, said thanks, and kept moving." Kellerman pushed off the doorframe, taking a slow step into the room. "Because I saw myself in you." Denise raised an eyebrow, skeptical but curious. "You were a janitor." He laughed quietly, shaking his head. "No, but I was overlooked. A lot. I came from nothing. My dad fixed cars in a town no one visits. I worked 3 jobs. Through college. People thought I didn't belong in rooms like this." Denise nodded slowly, understanding more than he probably realized. "Now you're the one deciding who gets in." Kellerman smiled faintly. "Exactly." There was a beat of silence between them before Denise looked down at the file still sitting on her desk. She ran her fingers lightly over the thick stack of papers, then glanced back up at Kellerman. "I'll be honest, I'm nervous." Kellerman smiled, but not in a dismissive way. "Good, means you care." Denise chuckled softly, then sighed, leaning back in her chair again, letting herself relax for the first time all day. "There's going to be people who hate this, who hate me." Kellerman nodded, not even bothering to soften the truth. "They'll get over it, or they won't. Either way, we're moving forward." He pushed his hands into his pockets, his posture casual, but his words carrying a quiet finality that told her this wasn't some impulsive gesture. He really believed in what he was doing, and in her. As Kellerman stepped back toward the door, he paused and added, "You have a story, Denise, a real one. And now, you've got a platform." Then, without waiting for her to respond, he slipped out of the office, leaving her alone with the folder, the plant in the corner, and the stunning view she hadn't quite gotten used to yet. Denise sat there for a long time after he left, thinking not about the contracts or the new title, but about all the years she'd spent crying. In bathroom stalls during lunch breaks, the nights she'd come home with aching feet, barely enough energy to heat up soup, the birthdays she'd missed, the promotions she'd watched go to people who never even looked her in the eye. Eventually, she opened the desk drawer, pulled out her old janitor badge, and placed it inside. not to forget it, but to remember exactly what it took to get here. But even as she closed the drawer and exhaled, she knew that this story wasn't just hers anymore. The spotlight was about to grow much brighter. By the end of the week, her nameplate was mounted outside her office. Denise Atwater, Cultural Liaison, International Affairs. Black letters on brushed steel. It looked official, clean, permanent. The company-wide email announcing her new role hit inboxes Friday morning, sent by Kellerman himself. It was short, clear, and carried more weight than any policy update or quarterly revenue report. He explained her role, her background, and, most importantly, her value. Kellerman didn't frame it as charity or some feel-good diversity story. He made it clear Denise was the best person for the job, period. But that didn't stop the noise. Some managers grumbled under their breath. Others softened once they saw her in action. She navigated conversations with foreign clients better than the software they'd been overpaying for, corrected mistranslations in contracts that had been costing the company money for years, and she never showed off. She just worked, quietly, smoothly, better than anyone had expected. By Monday, Denise was asked to sit in on a high-stakes meeting with a delegation from Morocco. The company's North African expansion had been stuck for months, tangled in layers of miscommunication and mutual mistrust. Denise walked into the conference room wearing a soft beige blazer, her nerves humming under the surface but her face calm and focused. She sat at the table, introduced herself, and then, without hesitation, began speaking in fluent Moroccan Arabic. The change in the room was instant. You could feel it, almost like the air itself had shifted. People who had been leaning back with crossed arms suddenly leaned forward, their expressions softening, their eyes sharpening with new attention. Because when someone speaks your language, it's not just about words, it's about respect, understanding, and acknowledgement. After the formal part of the meeting, one of the Moroccan partners approached her privately, placed his hand gently over his chest, a traditional sign of gratitude, and said quietly, "No one's ever done that for us. Not in our language, not like that." Denise simply nodded, offering him a small but genuine smile, and replied, "You matter, that's all." And for the rest of the day, even as she worked through more documents and responded to emails, that moment stayed with her. Not because it made her feel powerful, but because it reminded her why she loved languages in the first place. They build bridges where walls usually stand. By midweek, Kellerman made another move, something he'd been considering ever since he'd walked into the service level and seen Denise restocking microfiber cloths. Without a big announcement or any kind of ceremony, the plaque outside the company's main training room, the place where all new hires gathered for orientation and mid-level leaders held workshops, was quietly taken down. In its place, a new plaque went up, the Atwater Room. No big speech, no flowers, no cake. Just a simple, deliberate shift that meant more than any corporate luncheon ever could. Later that afternoon, Kellerman stood just outside that room, watching as a new group of interns filed in, notebooks and company-issued laptops in hand, chatting nervously about their first week. He overheard one of them whisper, "Who's that? Atwater?" A senior staff member replied casually but with an unmistakable tone of respect. "She's someone who reminded this place that greatness doesn't always come in a suit." That same day, Denise found a sealed envelope on her desk. No return address, just her name handwritten in neat block letters. Inside was a note, simple and direct. "I used to think I'd be invisible forever, but today I stood a little taller because of you. Thank you." No signature, just proof that people were watching, that people needed to see what was possible, that sometimes all it takes is one person being seen to help others realize they deserve to be seen too. Denise sat at her desk for a long time after reading that note, her fingers lightly brushing over the paper, her throat tightening in a way she hadn't expected. But she didn't cry. She didn't need to. That note wasn't just a thank you. It was a confirmation, proof that this wasn't just about her career or her paycheck, but about something much bigger. This was about what it meant for people like her, people who had been overlooked, underestimated, dismissed because of what they wore, where they worked, or the titles they didn't have. She folded the note carefully, slid it into her bag, and sat back in her chair, looking around her office. The same office that, just a few weeks ago, she couldn't have even imagined stepping into, much less calling her own. But Denise knew that not every door stays open without a fight, and as much as the last couple of weeks had felt like the tide was turning in her favor, she also knew something else was inevitable: pushback. And it didn't take long for it to show its face. Late Thursday afternoon, Denise was called into a meeting, not by Kellerman, but by someone higher up, someone she'd heard about but never met in person. Eleanor Craig, a senior board member who had been with the company since the 90s, known for her sharp suits, sharper tongue, and a reputation for keeping the company on course. Denise walked into the small, sterile conference room on the 17th floor, her posture straight, her expression calm, even as her heart pounded just a little harder than usual. Eleanor was already sitting at the table, a stack of papers in front of her, tapping a pen against the surface with a deliberate rhythm. Without looking up, she said, "Have a seat." Denise sat. Eleanor finally glanced up, her expression unreadable. Her tone clipped as she began. "So, Ms. Atwater, I've reviewed your file. No college degree, no previous corporate training, no management certifications." Denise didn't flinch. "That's correct." Eleanor folded her hands, leaning forward just slightly. "You were a janitor here 3 weeks ago?" Denise nodded. "I was." Eleanor leaned back, crossing her arms as she continued. "Help me understand how someone with your background is now handling high-level international affairs." Denise held Eleanor's gaze steadily, refusing to shrink under the weight of the question or the cold professionalism it was wrapped in. "Because I speak the languages. I understand the cultures. I've already fixed 2 vendor contracts and cleared a 3-month delay in our Morocco deal. I also helped secure a verbal agreement with our Brazilian partners that legal is finalizing next week." Eleanor pursed her lips, a small flicker of something, maybe surprise, maybe skepticism, passing through her otherwise stoic expression. "You think this company should be run on instinct and charm?" she asked, her voice edged with that familiar corporate sharpness that always made everything sound like a trap. Denise smiled faintly, not out of arrogance, but because she'd seen this kind of test before. "No, ma'am. I think it should be run on results." Eleanor blinked at that, a hesitation so brief most people wouldn't have caught it, but Denise did. She'd learned to read the small things over the years: the pause before a word, the slight shift in posture, the tapping of a pen that meant someone was holding back. Eleanor stood then, closing the folder in front of her with a slow, deliberate motion. "You're a gamble," she said, her tone clipped but not quite dismissive. Denise stayed seated, looking up at her with calm certainty. "I'm used to that. My entire life's been one." Eleanor didn't respond. She simply walked to the door, opening it in a way that signaled the meeting was over. Denise stood, nodded politely, and walked out without looking back. She didn't head straight to her office. Instead, she left the building entirely, stepping outside into the crisp air and sitting on a bench across the street, staring up at the glass tower she now worked in. For so many years, Denise had walked past that building wearing the same uniform, carrying cleaning supplies, wondering if anyone saw her. Now they all did, and not all of them liked it. She sat there for a while, letting the city noise wash over her, horns blaring, people chattering on phones, the distant hum of construction. But none of it broke through the wall of reflection she'd built around herself in that moment. She pulled out her phone and called the one person who always steadied her daughter. "Hey, Ma." Her daughter answered cheerfully, the sound of her voice instantly softening the edges of Denise's stress. "Everything okay?" Denise hesitated for a second, then nodded to herself, even though her daughter couldn't see it. "Yeah, just needed to hear your voice." Her daughter didn't press, didn't ask a dozen questions like she used to when she was younger. She just said, "You sure?" And Denise smiled, letting out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "I'm sure." They talked for a few minutes, mostly about nothing: groceries, her daughter's dog, a new movie she wanted to watch. But it was enough. Just hearing her laugh was enough to ground Denise, to remind her of everything she'd worked for, everything she'd sacrificed. After they hung up, Denise sat in silence for a few more moments, then stood up, brushed off her blazer, and walked back across the street. She rode the elevator up to her floor, walked past the same people who'd been whispering about her all week, and sat down at her desk, opening Victor's folder and getting to work like she'd done it 100 times before. By the next morning, word of Denise's meeting with Eleanor had somehow spread, as things like that always do in corporate environments where gossip moves faster than official memos. But to everyone's surprise, and maybe even to some people's disappointment, Denise didn't back down. She showed up early, as she always did, and led the morning team meeting with the same calm, focused presence she'd carried since day one in her new role. Later that morning, she took a call with the German office, handling it without needing a translator, moving through the complex discussion about shipping logistics and contract clauses as easily as most people might order coffee. She didn't brag about it. She didn't even mention it when the call ended. She just made a few notes, closed her laptop, and moved on to the next task. But the people around her noticed. They noticed the way she didn't let the whispers or sideways glances change how she walked into a room or how she spoke up in meetings. That same day, when she returned from lunch, there was something new on the whiteboard just outside her office door. 3 simple words written in blue marker. "We see you." No name, no explanation, just that. And it meant everything. Denise stood there for a minute, staring at those words, feeling their weight settle deep inside her chest. Because for so long, all she'd wanted was not for someone to give her something, but for someone to actually see her. In the weeks that followed, something strange and beautiful began to happen. People started coming to her, not just for translations, but for advice, for guidance, for confidence. It wasn't just about her language skills anymore. It was about the way she made people feel when they were around her. She became the person interns went to before big presentations, the one who sat with nervous new hires in the break room and gave them quiet pep talks without ever making them feel small. And she never talked down to anyone, whether it was a senior executive or someone from the cleaning crew she used to work alongside. One afternoon, Bao, a shy Vietnamese intern who had barely spoken above a whisper in his first week, approached her outside the elevator. "How did you learn all those languages?" he asked, his voice full of genuine awe. Denise smiled, resting a hand lightly on his shoulder. "One word at a time," she said. "Same way you will." It wasn't a rehearsed line or something she'd read in a self-help book. It was just the truth, as simple and direct as everything else about her. Denise wasn't just doing her job. She was quietly, steadily changing the culture of the company, showing everyone what it looked like to make space for others while holding your own ground. And maybe that's why, despite the pushback, the whispers, and the occasional side-eye glances, she kept walking through those glass doors every day, her head high and her heart steady. One afternoon, Kellerman caught up with her in the break room. He'd been hearing the same whispers, seeing the same looks, but he also noticed how people gravitated toward her, how even the most skeptical employees had started to respect her, not because they were told to, but because they saw her work, her consistency, her calm under pressure. He poured himself a cup of coffee and leaned casually against the counter as she stirred sugar into her own. "Been hearing good things," he said, his tone light but his eyes serious. Denise sipped from her cup, her posture as relaxed as it ever was. "Been trying to ignore the bad ones." Kellerman chuckled softly. "You're making waves." She looked at him, not defensive, just curious. "That a good thing?" He smiled, nodding. "Around here, it means you're doing something right." They stood in silence for a moment, not needing to fill the space with small talk. Then, as if it had just occurred to him, but really, it had been on his mind for weeks, he added, "You know, I've been thinking about starting a training program for internal talent, especially folks working in non-desk roles." He glanced at her then, gauging her reaction. "There's probably more Denises in this building." She didn't hesitate. "There are. They just haven't been seen yet." He nodded slowly, the idea crystallizing into something real. "Want to help me build it?" She smiled, not broadly, but with that same quiet confidence she always carried. "Already started, in my head." By the end of the month, the pilot program launched. They called it Voice Inside, a new initiative designed to give workers across departments access to language training, leadership mentoring, and visibility across divisions. It was Denise's idea, shaped by her experiences, her observations, and her deep belief that talent doesn't come pre-packaged in suits and degrees. The program caught fire almost immediately, with dozens of employees signing up, from cafeteria staff to warehouse workers to junior analysts who had been stuck in the same roles for years without anyone noticing their potential. Denise led the first few workshops herself, standing at the front of the room not as a polished corporate trainer, but as someone who had been where they were, who knew what it felt like to be unseen and unheard. She told them the same thing she'd told Bao, one word at a time, but this time she added something else. And don't wait for someone else to see your value. Start acting like you already know it's there. Word of the program spread beyond the company walls. Soon, Denise was invited to speak at a logistics leadership summit in Cincinnati. Standing on stage in front of hundreds of executives from across the industry, she didn't frame her story as some motivational tale with a neat, happy ending. She framed it as a reality check. I was never just a janitor, she told the crowd. I was fluent, I was capable, I was ready. But nobody ever looked long enough to see it. So the next time you pass someone without a title, ask yourself, what are you really missing? The room fell completely silent after she finished speaking, the kind of silence that doesn't come from confusion or indifference but from recognition. Everyone in that audience understood exactly what she meant. Then, slowly at first, and then all at once, the crowd rose to their feet, filling the auditorium with applause that echoed off the walls. Denise didn't linger on stage, didn't soak it in like some people might. She smiled politely, gave a small nod of thanks, and walked off with the same quiet grace that had carried her through every hallway, every shift, every unexpected meeting back at Halberg. On her way out, a young man approached her, his hands slightly trembling, his eyes glassy with emotion. "My mom's a housekeeper," he said, his voice thick. "She speaks 5 languages. I used to be embarrassed to say that." Denise reached out and touched his arm gently, offering him the kind of reassurance that didn't need many words. "Don't ever be ashamed of where you come from," she told him softly. "The only thing to be ashamed of is staying blind to brilliance." And with that, she kept walking, out of the building, back into the world that, for so long, had barely acknowledged her presence. But now it was different. Not because of the applause, not because of the title or the plaque on the training room door, but because she had never changed who she was to fit the role. She had brought herself, every layer of her story, every long night, every quiet act of resilience, into this new space. And that, she realized as she stepped into the sunlight outside the conference center, made all the difference. If there was one thing Denise hoped people took away from her story, it was this: never assume you know someone's worth based on what they wear, where they work, or what their resume says. Talent has no dress code, intelligence doesn't need permission, and brilliance can walk right past you wearing a name tag, holding a mop, speaking 9 languages fluently while you never even think to ask their name. She thought about all the times she'd been overlooked, underestimated, or flat out ignored. Not just by people at work, but in grocery stores, at school meetings, in all those small everyday moments where people make snap judgments based on uniforms, on accents, on how someone carries themselves when they think no one is watching. But now, she also thought about that note left on her desk, about the intern who wrote, "We see you," about the dozens of employees signing up for the program she'd helped build, about the executives who now asked for her input not as a courtesy, but because they needed it. Most of all, she thought about all the people who still hadn't been seen yet, the other Denises working overnight shifts, the quiet geniuses stocking shelves, driving buses, cleaning offices, waiting for someone to finally stop, look closer, and realize what they'd been missing all along. And as she walked back to her hotel that night, her shoulders back, her stride steady, she knew one thing for sure: she wasn't just sitting at the table now. She was making space for others to pull up chairs too. Back at Halberg International, the changes Denise had set in motion didn't stop with her new title or the Voice Inside program. The company began quietly, auditing their internal promotion practices, looking at departments they'd long neglected, questioning how many other stories they might have missed because they hadn't bothered to look past job descriptions or uniforms. Kellerman spearheaded a new committee focused on internal mobility, but even he knew that the real catalyst wasn't some policy. It was Denise. People talked about her in meetings, pointed to her when discussing leadership and innovation, and not just because she'd spoken 9 languages or helped fix critical deals with Morocco and Brazil. They talked about her because she'd reminded them all of something they should have known already: that potential doesn't always announce itself in a suit with a firm handshake and a polished LinkedIn profile. Sometimes it's hidden in plain sight, quietly doing the work, waiting for someone, anyone, to notice. Denise kept showing up, kept doing her job, kept mentoring younger employees who reminded her of herself, especially the ones who hadn't yet found their voice. She didn't chase recognition or let the newfound respect inflate her ego. She just kept moving forward, head high, shoulders squared, knowing that the space she'd carved out for herself was earned, not given. Months later, as she walked through the building, she passed the Atwater Room, a place where now every new hire started their orientation by hearing her story, not as a mandatory HR tale, but as an example of what happens when someone refuses to be defined by their circumstances. Denise would sometimes pause there just for a second to listen to the trainers explaining the history of the room, her name etched on the plaque beside the door. She never corrected anyone's version of her story because it didn't belong to her alone anymore. It belonged to every employee who'd ever felt invisible, who'd ever been underestimated, who'd ever doubted their own worth because no one had taken the time to see it. Denise knew that brilliance wasn't about where you started, but about what you kept doing, even when no one noticed. And now, as she walked back to her office, passing cubicles where people looked up and smiled, passing executives who nodded with respect, she carried that simple, unshakable truth with her. If you've ever been overlooked, underestimated, or ignored, keep going. The right person will see you. And when they do, don't be afraid to take that seat at the table. Better yet, bring a few more chairs with you.